let me take my spot here, and Secretary Steinberg will take questions from the podium. Let me raise one first myself. As you can see, it's the Wroclaw Global Forum. So the whole notion here was talking about how the transatlantic relationship can be applied globally, and you answered some of those questions. Let me raise one, however, that you didn't get to, which is non-proliferation, and particularly Iran, where the transatlantic partnership has worked relatively well. And then last week you announced 4 of Europe's 5 biggest oil companies agreed to end their investments in Iran. If you could talk a little bit about how you see the transatlantic relationship work with Europe, how important it is to that goal, but also, can one really be successful in keeping Chinese and other companies from filling the void? Are we just working to a situation of a containment policy rather than a stopping from proliferating policy?
Well, thanks, Fred. And I can't think of a better example of the critical importance of the transatlantic partnership than our work on Iran. As you all know, one of the strong commitments that the President made on taking office was to bring a new approach to our strategy on Iran, a strategy that was based on engagement, but not simply a bilateral engagement by the United States with Iran, but to work through, whether you want to call it the 3+3 or the 5+1, but the core partnership that we have with Europe to provide a common front, both in terms of our diplomatic engagement with Iran and our willingness to work together if that diplomacy does not succeed. And as you know from the early days, Bill Burns joined with his EU counterparts in our discussions with Iran. We sat down together in Geneva. We offered a way forward, which the Iranians were unwilling to take. And as a result of that, we developed a strong partnership that led in the UN Security Council and led to the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1929, the most powerful set of sanctions that have been adopted to date. And even more importantly, we worked together following the adoption of 1929 to take national actions to supplement and support that, including extraordinary measures taken by the EU, demonstrating, I think, first of the enormous capacity of the EU to act as a global actor, but also our ability to coordinate our efforts. And there's no doubt in my mind that that has had an enormous impact on Iran. Whether this successfully leads to the outcome we want, of course, is still open. And a clear example of this is the willingness to work together to create an environment where firms have recognized that it's not in their interest to allow Iran to feel that it has the space to continue the policies that it has been continuing with respect to its nuclear program. Now, our engagement goes beyond our common efforts. As you know, we've worked together with other countries around the world, whether it's Canada, Australia, Japan, and South Korea, all of whom have enacted measures to supplement 1929 and make clear to Iran the common international efforts on this. You've heard about the decisions that the Russians have made with respect to arms sales to Iran, a very powerful signal and a very important operational decision by the Russians not to move forward with these advanced air defense missiles. We have a very robust dialogue, both sides, both the United States and the EU with China, to make clear that we too expect them to be attentive to the consequences of continuing or deepening their engagement with Iran in ways that would send the wrong signals to Iran. And I think what's critical, we obviously hope that China sees why, in its own interest, that taking prudent measures now will help reinforce the diplomacy that China would like to see take place. But I think it's equally important to recognize that although there are places in which other countries may make a difference, that our willingness and the firms of the West, the United States and Europe, to disengage has a consequence which is far broader than just the monetary one. It's the technology, it's the know-how, the advanced capabilities of our firms in the energy sector, which is what Iran would really like to have access to. And so that has a disproportionate impact when Western firms disengage. And it's not just the energy sector. What we see is true in banking, in transportation, in insurance. So we've seen a really remarkable response by the international community. And now there's an opportunity for Iran to take a second look at this question, to re-engage in the diplomacy, to get back to a set of discussions which would respect their right under the NPT to have a peaceful civilian nuclear program, but a recognition that, given their past track record, that the obligation is on Iran to demonstrate to all of us that its activities are exclusively peaceful.
And if sanctions and all of that don't bring the desired effect, would the administration, can you still imagine military consequences? And when people talk about the transatlantic relationship in that respect, one could imagine a significant rift.
Fred, when I was a professor at UT, hypotheticals were an important part of my job. As Deputy Secretary, I don't find them very useful. I would simply observe that we have said that all options remain on the table, and we've also made clear that we all would prefer a diplomatic resolution. That's what we're focused on. I think we have an opportunity now, and that's where we're going to focus our efforts.
Okay, one more non-hypothetical question, and then I'll pass to the audience and I'll see hands. That was also not in your speech, but obviously you can't put everything in. We're here sitting in Europe at the time of one of the most dramatic political and economic shifts from west to east. You recently in Geneva said that the U.S. must build strategic trust with China to match the scope and depth of the transatlantic relationship. Also, you've talked about strategic reassurance with China to build a more comprehensive relationship. My question would really be, can you build strategic trust with of the level of transatlantic relationship with a country that has a different political system? And this gets to the whole question of how one interacts with state capitalism with non-democratic countries. And how does the European relationship with the U.S. help us manage our relationship with China?
Well, I think it's a very it's an important question, because I do think that the flip side of my observations is that we have demonstrated in the case of our relationship with Europe that the issue of strategic trust is simply not a question. Even when we've had transatlantic differences, and sometimes they've been quite substantial, whether it's the balance of payments or INF or all of those issues, that I don't think there was ever a doubt on both sides of the Atlantic that our core interest and our core objectives were in common. And so we could deal with challenges as deep as the French withdrawal from the Unified Military Command, or all of the other issues that we've had to deal with over the past 60 or 70 years, because we had that level of strategic trust and confidence in each other and each other's objectives. And there's no doubt that that values-based dimension contributed to that, because we had a core conviction that democracies would work together effectively, shared common interest in freedom and open societies, that we could preserve our common bonds and our ability to work together. It is a much more daunting task, not simply because of the lack of democracy in China, but because of its very closed and non-transparent system. And there are clearly steps that can be taken, even short of political reform in China, that would help that process. So transparency and openness is critical, and that's why we've emphasized, and in Geneva I put such a high emphasis on the importance of restoring the military-to-military dialogue. And we're now taking steps with China to move in that direction, that they be more transparent about their military modernization, about their activities around their periphery, about their natural resource investments around the world, which have raised questions around the world, including in terms of their relationships with Iran. I think inevitably we will never achieve the same level of confidence with a country that doesn't share our political values and our system, but I think a lot of progress could be made if China is prepared to provide the kinds of reassurances that are necessary. And I think it's critical, because I've talked about this, but it needs to be understood, that when we talk about strategic reassurance, the challenge, particularly in a closed society, and for an emerging power like China, is for it to reassure its neighbors and the rest of the world that it sees its rise consistent with the interest of other countries, its neighbors and others. Europeans understand very well the challenge of rising powers and the need for those powers to provide that kind of reassurance. And that same challenge is what we face in East Asia today. It is a critical challenge, and it is something that we can work together very effectively on. The more we communicate in parallel with China on our objectives and our interests, the more effective we're going to be, and that we communicate both in terms of economic policy and the importance of China taking responsible measures to rebalance its economic strategy and to participate in a rule of law friendly way in the international trading system, to its own efforts on the security side. And I think that's clearly a shared interest. I know that on the part of the EU that there's a renewed focus on developing a strategy towards China, and I welcome the fact that Lady Ashton and others have reached out to the United States to see if we can find common way forwards on those questions.